the nature of the changes that have occurred over the last 20 years and the level of, I would say, control that First Nations have gained has been a great opportunity, but it's really putting new types of pressures on new leaders for management, good governance, the ability to manage now, because with the opportunity becomes the responsibility and the accountability.
Welcome to Rez Dog Walkers. We're getting into season 3. I'm not even quite sure what episode we're at, but today is one of those days where the world just gets a little bit easier for me. When I first started my journey in the Great Bear Rainforest, we were really just individual First Nations invited to this multi-sectoral planning process. And over the years, the First Nations started to homogenize together and communicate a little bit. And some of the regional groups were born. Namaqua's Council was incorporated in 2007, thanks to the work that was done by Coastal First Nations of the Turning Point Initiative, I believe is the full name under the Societies Act. But today I have with me we'll say you're infamous today. We have the infamous Garry Wouters, who's played a great role in the development of the Great Bear Rainforest agreements, in the government-to-government relationships, and it's come to my understanding that you've also been a deputy minister once or twice within different levels of government. How are you doing, Garry?
Good. So kind words. Thank you.
Well, I usually try to have kind words for you. You're a pretty kind guy, and you and I have been through some great battles together. Just for my guests, I mean, some days I have 12 followers, some days I have a couple thousand. We'll be interested to see how many we get for this episode, but maybe just a little introduction to yourself. I mean, I know, you spent some time within the provincial and federal governments at a senior bureaucratic level. I know your love for the coast of British Columbia is pretty there, but why don't you just give us and I know you're a prairie guy. All you deputy ministers are all prairie guys. I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I'm from Saskatchewan, grew up in a small town and of 250 people, and went to university from there, and the rest is history. But my experience in government was at both provincially. We started with the provincial government in Saskatchewan, and then went over to the federal government, and then moved from there. But kind of at the senior level, I held the positions as a deputy in Saskatchewan at one time, but then went to the federal government, worked up as a regional director general in Ontario, and went to Ottawa, and got recruited as a deputy in BC, went to the Aboriginal program first, and then post-secondary. My final gig over there was Deputy of Finance. Went back to Ottawa as an Associate Deputy Minister of Indian Affairs.
That's right.
Came back here, head of a Crown corporation, took early retirement. Decided to go back to work for a year as a consultant. And I've been doing that 1 year consulting for the last 20 years. I've had many retirement parties. Someone asked me the other day, any advice about how to retire? I says, it's easy. I've done it 15 times.
I bet you've seen a lot over the years because, as you said, you grew up in Saskatchewan, small town, so that's probably why you understand First Nations communities as well as you do, with that rural kind of small town vibe that exists in our communities.
Yeah, there is a kind of cultural element of growing up, I think, particularly in the West and the prairies, that I always found somewhat different than the East, and not to be over prejudiced on it, but a better sense of perspective and humor I always found in the West, but that's the nature of my experience. Yeah.
Nice. You had some time with the governments, and that put you in a position to do some consulting. And when I first met you, it was actually quite an introduction, because Art Sterritt Gujau came walking into a room that we were dealing with for a couple of years. It was in the dying days of the NDP government. We were talking about the Central Coast land use plans.
That's right.
And I remember we had sort of negotiated where we were in the process. I mean, I think we announced the Great Bear Rainforest like 11 times throughout the NDP government, the different Liberal governments. But I remember you guys came in just kind of out of nowhere and just announced your presence with authority. First, how did you get tangled up with Art Sterrett and Gujow back in that early days?
Well, I first got involved in an indirect way. I was in charge of a Crown corporation and asked to do a public policy on forestry, and so there were a number of hearings. One was in Haida Gwaii, another one was in Prince Rupert and that. And through that, I just met them incidentally, really, and that was my first type of connection with them.
Back when Gujaw's name was Garry. Still.
Yeah, that's right. And then secondly, David Suzuki was involved in doing some of the organization with the nations on that. And I got a call from David to meet with Art and Guj and the whole group, and then went up to Prince Rupert to meet with them. And I can remember the question was, Gujow introduced himself and talked about the fights that they had, the War of the Woods, all that activity.
Or Moresby, sorry.
Yeah, and the kind of protests that were going on. And so I introduced myself and I said, well, I have a question first. I said, why are you even wanting to talk to me about work? I says, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not in the courts, and I haven't got out on a protest, and likely not that good at it either. And Guj says, well, those have worked for us, but he says, it's about time we sit down and start, how do we work with government? And we like your experience, so we wouldn't mind just testing it out. That was the way I started.
It was really a game changer back in those days for First Nations to organize themselves. I mean, we came together in other rooms because government mandated us to, but CFN was the first time, at least in my short experience at that point, where someone came in on their own volition and just said, you know what, here we are, and you're going to deal with us now.
Yeah.
And I think of some of the leaders that are around the table at that time. I think the late Chief Percy Starr and Ben Robinson, who's still with us. Yeah. But just just some of your thoughts on, this is a new road for you, obviously, been bureaucratic and been through a lot of those systems. What was it like walking into some of these, stakeholder models and government discussions on the other side? And I'll use my air quotes for people who are just listening in their cars, but the First Nations weren't really a force to be reckoned with. Haida had come through, we had a couple of Supreme Court cases, but Delgamuukw was still working its way through the system.
Well, in some ways, I came in at a right time, okay? Timing's always an important part of our work, isn't it? I came in a time of where the fatigue had happened in the woods, the fight with the enviros and industry, the difficulty at the land use planning tables of not really getting consensus, industry in some ways being forced to come to the table because of the protest at the marketplace. And so all of that came in. So as I came into that, and the idea was, we came in united to come in. We have had great leaders who clearly wanted to come in and play a role and exercise power in some balancing way that the environments were having, the industry was having, and government, some ways, looked to us to help work this out as well. So the timing, I think, was a really critical part. So the job was not difficult. I just moved I moved from one government to another government. That was the level of power that I think we had at that time. So wouldn't have happened like 5 years earlier than that. So I think timing was an important part of coming in, because people were ready. First Nations were ready for the dialogue. Government wanted, and industry and enviros needed it.
Needed it to get out of their stalemate,
That's
right?
exactly right.
But I'm glad you brought it up that way because, you know, we were ready to, you know, take our rightful position in the management of, you know, resources and development in those discussions. But I think of some of the other deputies I've met along the road, like our mutual friend who just passed away recently, John Allen. You know, he was Deputy Minister of Forests during the early part of the War in the Woods, and we never even got a sniff of him. We never knew what he looked like. And then when he came back, when I believe Don Wright hired him after Horgan came to power, and you introduced me, you're like, hey, I think you should sit down and have a discussion. So you introduced me to John Allen, and, you know, we had that cordial discussion, and then him and I had a couple follow-ups, and he looked at me one day and he just says, you guys weren't even a speck on the radar back when I was in charge of running these things. So just talking about the time for things to be ready was interesting. You know, we've told the story of the Great Bear in a million different places in a million different ways. And while you weren't the guy on the stage with us, you were the guy who was helping prepare us and get us to the stage. I think of a couple of the times you and I, you know, we'd have an announcement. Remember when Trudeau came out to announce the marine planning process, and right up to like 11:30 at night, the night before, they're calling us from the plane, like, Trudeau's going to be there in the morning. Do you guys have a deal? And you and I are just working all the different chiefs, and it was almost like a mafia thing, like, okay, you sit in that corner, I'll sit in that corner, and we'll send them to each other. And we ended up working out a consensus that got us through the process to get the announcement done. But you know, just some of your thoughts in a preliminary way of just the growth of First Nations taking that place, of being in a position where we're starting to dictate the terms, because you were there really at the infancy of that. And now that you've been doing it, you know, you've been retired for 20 years and you haven't worked harder. Just some of your thoughts on where we were to where we're at now.
Well, I think what was fortunate about it is, I first of all start with the nature of the leadership that we have and had. Okay, I mean, there were leaders, really confident leaders that basically really understood the various roles of what they could play. They also were very, very good about what I call the bureaucracy that worked for them, including, you know, myself and that. In a sense, they clearly understood that good staff, good bureaucracy, good people, okay, who understand their vision, have a role and responsibility to develop strategy and information. And they played a key role in listening and giving advice and direction on that. But they also gave us the freedom to really reach out and hire good people and develop options, and were willing to look at different solutions, okay? There wasn't one best approach at all. So I found that very refreshing, because in bureaucracy, you can get really stereotyped fairly quickly in those kind of jobs. And in that, so there was a lot of ability for creativity. And so we had good leadership, good staff, and also we had an agenda around location, the Great Bear Rainforest, like a world-class kind of a location. And finally, it was big. And what I've learned over the years many times, if you really want to bring change, and that's the importance of leaders coming together, it can be of such a significance that it draws the attention of political leaders who themselves are worried about their own legacy. And it gives them a chance to say, I was part of that at that side too, you know. So I think those dynamics of leadership, bureaucracy, strategic thinking, and that, and being big, you know.
I think that's one thing that you helped us learn was we always had big aspirations, but our vision never, you know, equaled where we wanted to get. And I think you helped us understand how to build our pipeline to achieve that. And I use pipeline kind of tongue in cheek just because I think of Northern Gateway and some of the other challenges that we've had to go through. But
You do give me a little bit too much credit, but I'll take it. But
no,
on the other hand,
you were a catalyst for change. Yeah.
Well, what I did appreciate that people also understood the element of incrementality. Mm-hmm. We didn't have to win everything to the level of the vision. Yeah. If we could reach it there and then move from there, and if you think over the last 20 years, what we had negotiated at the beginning was the nature of a land use plan. Mm-hmm. But the decisions about managing that plan and having control over the resources of those plans, those were later stages, weren't they? They didn't all happen at the big, we want it all, we want all the resources, we want to manage it all. It was some incrementality that
I think that
helped a lot, I think.
I think that's some of you helped us put our vision into segments that work that way. Okay, if we did this, it gave us a foothold to stand on to do this. So instead of raising the roof like treaty deals do, treaties about, getting the home run that fits everything into a nice package. Yeah. And you taught us the incremental side, or helped illustrate the incremental side, because that's what public servants were comfortable with. Yeah. Deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers didn't want to try get the full package done because it wasn't their mandate. That was the politician's job.
Exactly.
But when you started, having us work with the Don Wrights of the world, I think when Don Wright was the deputy minister of forests, and I think I was 24 years old at the time. It was this clique of you, me, Googe, and Art, and sometimes Bruce Watkinson would come with us. But me and Bruce were the young guys to kind of clean up the mess after Googe and Art tore him a new one, sort of thing. But the one thing that always resonates with me is revenue sharing. Yeah. We watched the War in the Woods. We were part of the planning and the strategic decisions around how protected areas were going to be done. But revenue sharing from the development of forest resources was something that we had never even been able to break skin on or anything. Right. And you helped us come together as CFN and Namakolis, and it was before Namakolis was even really incorporated. But I remember the first couple of discussions we had with Don Wright, and I think Dave Porter joined us for some of those discussions. But I remember the first time we walked in and we negotiated this package for a potential revenue sharing opportunity. And I remember Googe and I and Art were kind of debating. We'd always sit down and have a coffee after the meetings, and Googe would tell us what he thought and Art would say, and finally they sort of asked me what I thought, and I'm just kind of like, well, it's not what we want, but it's more than we got right now. And
one role I did play, partly because I was a bureaucrat and understood that world in a way that many times we have to find ways to help the government solve their problems, okay? We know our problems and what solutions are, but many times the kind of nature that the province might face politically, if First Nations take control, quote, Indians are running the town now, that kind of attitude, and how in some ways we showed them that it could work to the benefit of both. Like, look today, 20 years ago that time, forest companies were essentially whacking the woods, but also getting the economics out of the wood, having construction camps most of the time, no jobs, no benefits, no revenue. I think today, likely 50 to 60% of the tenures are now owned by the nations themselves. Yeah. And that's only going up, okay? Yeah. Like they're really beginning to control the economics. Definitely. As well as the land and water,
But if we weren't able to take some of those first incremental steps, we never would have gotten to a position where we did that. Right. And I tell this story at the Leadership Council, and it's funny, some days I try to wonder why the Leadership Council doesn't get along with me so much. And then I'm like, okay, because I'm always giving them shit for something. But I remember when we sat down and we said it's going to be 50 cubic meters per person in a community and $500. And we told them, that's nowhere near what we need to get. Shove it up your ass. No, we're not going to sign on to that. And then they took that exact same deal to the Leadership Council and they endorsed it within a week. And we're all kind of like, you guys. But it was a fundamental starting point because we raised the floor a little bit. We raised the bar on where that went to a point where, like you said, I mean, Namaqualis Council, the 4 nations within Western's TFL are now 38% owners.
Are they?
You know, we've invested our time and money, and we got some help from the province to buy a little bit more of an equity stake. Yeah. And so now we're controlling some of the exact same areas that we were in dispute about for, you know, years and generations. Yeah. And having the ability to work through some of that was cool. And I think one of the things I always got as being the younger guy in the room, you know, following you and Googe and Art around, was just the fact that the potential is really there because, like you said, if you could solve a government problem, you became known as a problem solver. Yeah. And that's one of the things that helped Namaqualis and CFN to a certain extent was we would solve a couple government problems that gave us the ability to try solve more that brought benefit to us. And I think of the clearinghouse, the referrals process that Namaqualis really started. There was always this healthy competition between CFN and Namaqualis, even though we were working to achieve the same thing. We took different paths. Yeah. Yeah. And I remember always telling people, like, when you guys negotiated your reconciliation protocol, I said, well, mine was negotiated first, but they announced theirs first. And so there's always this little one-upmanship that we're always doing with each other, tongue-in-cheek, because we grew a great respect for each other over the years. Like, I just think of when Art and Googe called and said, nope, we're going to go talk to this person. We want you to come here. But I want you to shed some light on, you know, let's go back to the late 90s, early 2000, before the Liberals swept to power with the 77-2, I believe it was in 2001 election, if I can remember correctly. There's a meeting with Gordon Campbell when he was the leader of the opposition. You know, there's a little bit of lore around that being, you know, there is no agreements made. Obviously, you can't make a deal with the leader of the opposition, but there's a commitment to continue talking about solving some of those problems. You know, were you in the room when that discussion happened with Gordon Campbell?
Not a lot. No, I wasn't in that. I mean, I was in the room with him a lot during the process when they were in government because clearly he ended up playing a pretty strong leadership on some of the kind of developments we did. Okay.
Oh, definitely him, Stan Hagen, Jeff Plant.
I had come in, of course, at the time when Glenn Clark had just left government, and I think Desange was acting premier. Remember that interim period?
Yeah.
And that's the.
I've actually got assigned. We didn't get our agreement done with them, but we're so close. Like I said, we always negotiate. Yeah. And Ujjal Dosanjh sent the government page on it and says, "Here, just take that to the deputy next week, and we'll work the rest out. But stand on the podium with us." You know, going through some of those things and watching some of the generational change. I mean, you came to us out of retirement, and I say us in the global Great Bear Rainforest First Nations wise, but you know, you got to deal with Ben Robinson and Percy Starr, and now you're dealing with, you know, Doug Nieselas and Isaiah Robinson, you know, Ben's great nephew. What's some of the generational changes you've seen as younger leaders have stepped? I think of Trevor Russ in the Council of Haida Nation. You know, now he's an acting role in CFN. He's part of the administration there. I think of Gagwis, you know, filling not only Gujau's shoes, Miles Richardson's shoes. You know, just some of your thought on the evolution of the leaders in the Great Bear.
To a great extent, the nature of the changes that have occurred over the last 20 years and the level of, I would say, control that First Nations have gained has been a great opportunity, but it's really putting new types of pressures on new leaders for management, good governance, the ability to manage now, because with the responsibility, with the opportunity becomes the responsibility and the accountability. And over the last number of years, I've been really associated a lot with the idea of good governance and building constitutions and setting up kind of bureaucracies and dispute mechanisms that nations have to do if they're going to, you know, we moved from an advocacy kind of role at the beginning to a role of really more and more jurisdiction and management
regulators
control.
And whatnot. Yeah,
that's right. So those leaders have a much broader level of responsibilities today than the other leaders did. But the other leaders were critical in setting the stage for that.
Well, they had opened the doors, right?
But it's, as we said, the evolution of it has put a whole new level of responsibilities of young leaders, of management and that.
Well, I'm glad you put it that way, because I think of, guys like myself who were just a warm body that could be sent to the table because other guys were too busy with treaty and other guys were doing other things, to where now we're developing this leadership. Again, I go back to Isaiah Robinson. He's got a MBA in business management. Now he's the band manager. He's acting chief, and they're just picking up the baton and even running a little bit further with it now. It's interesting as we've been through, some of the challenges that we face. I think of Northern Gateway, which really galvanized us as coastal people. The fear of Northern Gateway and the potential damage that it could do really brought us together in a time when we probably really needed it. I see there's a Northern Gateway 2 being proposed right now, and I see CFNs leading the charge on what part of no don't you understand. But it adds to, I guess, I'm setting the context for the work we're doing in other rooms. We are talking about transportation in other rooms. We are talking about liquefied natural gas in Haisla territory. So what's just some of your thoughts on, I was talking with one of our guests before, and I hate getting painted with the brush that I'm either a conservationist as a First Nations leader or an economic developer. And the whole premise of the Great Bear Rainforest was the balance for human well-being, economic well-being, but also ecological well-being. And I think we've done that and we've portrayed that. But now that we're trying to implement it and make it actionable, we get people saying to us, well, how can you do fish farms, or how can you do forests because you protected the Great Bear? And my response is always, well, I protected the Great Bear, so I need to do this because I need revenue to do the other things that we need. You were a deputy minister within INAC, you're associate deputy minister in INAC for a while. You knew in the 80s how challenging the housing issues were, and now First Nations are developing own source revenue to pick up the slack that ISK and other Crown agencies can't really keep up with anymore. Just some of your thoughts on the balance between economy and conservation.
I mean, clearly, First Nations were extremely upset about the level of forestry activity. I mean, in Haida, they were cutting, I think the annual allowable cut was, what was it? 2 billion to 2.2.
Like 2.2 or 2.1 or something
and
like that.
Ecosystem-based management, which came in as a conservation method on how we looked at managing the sustainable forestry, dropped it down to $1 million. And so I remember Gujal meeting with the minister. He says, it's not hard to be an environmentalist in Haida Gwaii when you see all the wood going on barges out, no jobs, no benefits, no resources to us.
Just stumps.
That's it. So he says it's easy, that our people don't want that, etc. It's not our way of life, But today the challenge is different, because with the kind of work that's been done on the land and now on the marine, it's the ability to do restoration and bring it back to a level of sustainability. But the communities and the people are the third part of well-being. And that means you need an economy. And nations are now more, as those other issues get dealt with, are more involved in dealing with that economy. And it's becoming challenging, and it's becoming different. You have some First Nations much more stronger advocate on development side, especially on things like LNG, where others still may have some concerns from an environmental concern. But First Nations are very much involved in that balance and thinking about it. Previously, they weren't even involved in any of it.
No, it didn't really matter, did it?
And so first the land, then the water, but human well-being is clearly an important part of, restoration.
Definitely.
From colonization or from colonization.
I think one of the evolutions I've been proud to see is the role of municipal government in some of that. Don't get me wrong, in some areas it's a pain in the ass that has to be managed still. But as people started to see us take, and controls probably a strong term, but as we started to get incorporated into the decision making, it really scared a lot of people. People were like, over my dead body, should those Indians be allowed to make those decisions? But then when they realized that any wealth we created was regional wealth,
Yeah.
You know, the Council of Haida Nation now owns the 10 years that worked there. We talked about that 2 million cubic meter cut that was unsustainable. Well, now it's at a sustainable level, but the Haidas manage it now.
Yeah.
And they have to find that balance. And the local communities are supporting them to do that. You know, we just came from Union of BC municipalities where we were talking about the rural-urban divide and how First Nations and reconciliation get caught up in that. Nothing bugs me more than when industries talk about First Nations being the reason that economics isn't happening, when there's so many of us fighting so hard to try find a path forward on that. And the general public wants to focus in on the half a dozen communities that just don't want anything to their end. That's what they want for their communities. That's fine. Yeah. But they can't be slowing the rest of us down for what we're trying to achieve for our communities. But another question that I've got for you is, you know, I know as Numicals was in its infancy, we were trying to find someone like yourself. I remember once sort of teasing you like, you want to come work a little farther down the coast and get into things. And then we hired Wally Emer. Yeah. If you'll remember, Wally Emer was one of the provincial reps we negotiated against at the table for so long. Yeah, that's right. And then after the Great Bear got done, anyone who was intimately involved in the final result just got sent to different places. Lindsay Jones got sent out to go do something else. You know, Doug Call's probably the only one who got promoted out of it. But everybody else got, and Wally Emer was sitting at the environmental assessment office, really just pushing paper around. And so I remember asking you, you know, do you think the province would second him to me? He's like, the only way you're going to find out is ask. And I'm like, well, he's like, well, go to the top. And I remember you telling me to call Jessica McDonald and say, hey, you know, we're trying to implement these things that help you. We need some help. And we actually have one of your employees who we think can help do that. Within 2 weeks, Wally was seconded to Numicals Council
I didn't know that,
until the end of his actual provincial time. And then when his provincial time was up and he retired, he came back and worked another 7 years for us. Similar to you a little bit. You know, the jump between provincial and federal governments was something, and again, it looks like I'm blowing smoke up your ass because I haven't seen you in a while, but that was something that we struggled with. You know, whenever we went to Ottawa, it was always about housing or health or infrastructure needs. But as we got the Great Bear Rainforest done, we realized that we had to start working with Ottawa at a lot more preliminary levels. What was just some of your thoughts on, I know you did a lot of work at kind of solutions table type atmospheres where you still had a lot of contacts within the senior civil service in Ottawa. But I think of some of the early discussions we had with Michael McKean when he was the Deputy Minister of Transport, and we were starting to talk about that. Like, did you find it hard kind of advocating for First Nations, but bringing in some of your bureaucratic contacts and colleagues that you built relationships with? What was like that for you, being the middle guy in between a little bit? Was that a challenge? Was it something you enjoyed? You must have enjoyed it because you did it really well for a long time.
Well, generally, not all the time, but generally, bureaucrats want to be able to do a good job. They want to do a good job, and they appreciate if they have opportunities to be involved, okay, number one. Number two, the nature of what you call Canada, the federal government, is the nature of the federal system, and the nature of the bureaucratic system is the senior policy makers are all in Ottawa, and the policy implementers are at the regional level.
At the RDG level, yeah.
At the RDG level. And clearly, they are giving mandates that are policy mandates, and that's legitimate, but have very little scope to change mandates, okay? And so that's where the relationship with Ottawa was a critical part. And, you know, when you get into these particularly processes, I always found it was critical in the processes that you establish. You may have a technical level that the people here can work with our people, you know, our technical people. But at the policy level, you've got to create a relationship in your decision-making structure with people from Ottawa, because they have to understand the problem better. And First Nations are able to articulate that better than their own bureaucrats are. They're listened to much more. And so it became an obvious kind of part of the process is to build structures to involve and keep Ottawa as part of that in a policy way, okay?
I actually plagiarize that from you a lot. I always talk about the technical, bureaucratic, and decision-making level. I mean, there's two levels of bureaucrats. There's bureaucrats who take stuff in, but then there's bureaucrats who recommend whatever changes they're going to make, and learning how to nuance. Like, we had to learn that First Nations politicians didn't need to be mucking it up at the technical level. Let's hire technicians. Let's hire biologists and geologists and foresters to do that kind of work, but monitor as it goes up the chain. And that's something that I think is really, the Great Bear was really built around, and that was some of your influence, some of our readiness and eagerness to try to find our spot in the world, and doing that incremental approach. But you know, we never talked about this from a point of reconciliation when we were doing it. We did it because it was just what needed to be done. Now that we try to define everything as reconciliation now, just some of your thoughts as a guy who's getting closer to sitting in the spectator seat. I mean, I know you still dabble and you're still doing some work with a couple nations, but you know, as the government of Canada makes all these commitments to Indigenous people, they don't have any of these solution tables that we developed during the Great Bear Rainforest to help achieve that. So what's just some of your thoughts on where we need to go in the next little while to continue to build the relationship? I mean, the Great Bear, and there's 4 or 5 other good examples of collaborative government to government work, but in the other 70% of the country and the province, we don't have tables like that are producing the kind of results that we've been able to build. I mean, the international campaign on forest wood products gave us the room and the capacity to do it. But now that we need to transfer this to other rooms, like if you were back in a deputy minister seat again, would you be dealing with things a little bit differently? I guess is sort of the question.
Oh, yeah. I mean, clearly, I mean, number one, where we need help, I've talked about First Nations, is, as I say, in governance and strategic thinking, strategic planning, and exercising our jurisdiction and management, okay? And there's 2 parts to it, is how do you build that capacity? And it's difficult to do it at every nation level, by the way. There's some advantages. You'd ask, one of the reasons of success is that by having a collective, it gave us power, but it also gave us the ability to think things out collectively with like yourselves and that, and develop ideas in that. So, you know, as you build a new economy, how do you help support the nations develop that strategic thinking and opportunity? So that's a new challenge, I think, that First Nations have. And the nature of resourcing and financing First Nations, I think, is one of the biggest kind of issues that have not really been dealt with very well, okay? I mean, too much of the funding is just developed on funding formulas and not take into consideration the condition of the community, some form of equalization grants, okay? There are some First Nations quite wealthy, and good for them, nothing wrong with that. But they get the same level of funding that a nation that is very poor gets. And so how does that nation, who particularly geographically, does not have the same location opportunity if you're around Vancouver, okay? And I think the financing of First Nations on a needs basis with good strategic thinking is really a next step for creating a standard of living that other Canadians live, that First Nations can get, okay? I think we're getting the jurisdiction, we're getting control of the resourcing and the management decisions, but the strategic planning and the resource revenues to go to the next step, it needs a lot of work on yet, I think.
It's interesting watching the bureaucracy try to catch up with the commitments that the politicians are making on both sides. I think of what we tell our community now of things that we're hoping to aspire, but they're tough steps that are going to be made, but the communities always want to see progress, just like general public and society, I guess. You know, I know we're getting close close to our time together this morning or this afternoon, whatever time it may be now. But how much more do you got in you now? I know you're playing golf. I wish you were playing golf 20 years ago, because then you would have been working for me sooner, or with me. Sorry,
no, it's
me.
Yeah. I've made a commitment to slow it down by Christmas time and maybe keep a couple of projects, but my time is done on it. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. You ask about the nature of working in bureaucracies, and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed working in bureaucracy and the opportunities that provided to me. But looking back the last 20 years and saying, what have I really helped accomplish with folks? It's the work I've done in here the last 20 years that have really made a difference.
Yeah.
Bureaucracies can have ideas of developing policies that might make a difference, but we're in a position to develop a framework in that policy to implement it and make it work. And that's creates a lot more satisfaction.
That's pretty cool, isn't it? I think of the early days where we're just saying, one day we want to do this, one day we want to do that, and now we're doing it.
Yeah.
And we're doing it, to the betterment of some of our communities. I think the level of well-being has improved. Coast Funds, which I'm fortunate enough to be the chairman of the board of now, is managing over $430 million of endowment that's going to help keep our stewardship offices open for perpetuity. Those are things that were just we didn't even know how to dream those kinds of things back in the early days of slugging it out with the forest companies and the environmentalists and whatnot. One other just sort of parting thought, do we need to see more First Nations people in the senior civil service? I think of, we got First Nations getting elected into office now, which is a tremendous step. I think of our good friend Ellis Ross, who's going to make the world a different place. Jody Wilson-Raybould obviously has left her mark on Canadian politics. We're doing well on that level. We're seeing more and more First Nations. I took a run in 2017, came up a little bit short, but we're seeing more First Nations people get into the policy, political, get elected representative side, but we're not really seeing as much in the bureaucracy, or we are, and we're just not seeing it as a stamp or as part of the equation.
Yeah. Well, the Harvard School, the Kennedy School talks about good government and what makes it work. And one of the issues is what they call a cultural match. In other words, you can't import a non-Indigenous model of governance into an Indigenous community. It needs that kind of cultural match. Having a federal bureaucracy, a provincial federal bureaucracy with First Nations who understand that, creates a diversity in the bureaucracy that can bring new ideas in and better understand it. So I think a bureaucracy with diversity of nationalities, et cetera,
cultures,
creates a much healthier bureaucracy than one that used to be just all men.
Old white men specific.
Exactly right.
And with all due respect to you and your brother, who played the big roles in that, but I always learn something sitting with you. We always have these relaxed conversations, and I definitely, as I was getting ready for your appearance here on Rez Dog Walkers, I was just thinking of the countless moments that you and I just sort of worked our way through. And I don't just mean you and I personally as the only two who were there. There's lots of other people in the room in the early days. There was Art and Googe, and Paul Correa came to help a little bit, and Merv Child, who still works with me at Numwakos today.
Merv,
we figured out our machinery in the Great Bear, and everybody tries to say, well, how come you just can't replicate that everywhere? And I think our discussion today shows that there is just a time and a place that lined up really well for us to achieve some of the results that we've achieved. So,
well, and I want to just say in closing, I want to thank you particularly and a number of other leaders that even gave me this kind of opportunity. And one thing in 20 years is the kind of level of respect that people show to you. We may be different and things like that, but I've never been in a situation where people were angry with each other, that I was involved with, where anger was being frustrated. We had differences, et cetera, So, I mean, I look back to say, I'm a lucky guy to be able to be part of this work of this changing environment with you. And I want to thank people like you who have really been instrumental in providing that leadership and the type of support that we needed as your bureaucrats to make that work. It really has made a difference. And it's been that unique combination that's hard to duplicate. But I think it, when I take a look at leadership and the bureaucracy and how that worked for each of us, was a unique experience,
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't happen every other place,
No, and I think that's why I was glad to have you on to talk about it, because I think the more we share some of these experiences, the less foreign it's going to be for the people who try it next.
Yeah.
So, well, keep up, and we'll get together for a game of golf soon. I hope so. We'll drink some wine, play some golf, and we'll tell some stories.
Good for you. Take care.
Thanks for coming, Garry.
Yep.
I want to thank my visitors and people for being here today on Rez Dog Walkers. I look forward to BC Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, June 3rd to 5th, 2026 in Nanaimo. Until then, everybody keep living the best way you can, and we'll see you all soon. Ow, 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 ow! Yo, yo, ho, hey, yo, yo.